both yes and no. Yes, I was surprised in the fact that he is one of the leading neoconservative thinkers on the planet. And who would have ever thought that he would issue such a stark statement about the fact that we have lost the war in Iran and there is simply no hope, and that this is probably the greatest defeat that the United States has ever suffered in its history. You just didn't expect that from somebody like Bob Kagan. But it's not surprising in the sense that anybody with a triple digit IQ viewing what's going on in the world today, I think, can't help but understand that we're in deep trouble and that we have no winning formula in Iran. And furthermore, from Kagan's point of view as a neoconservative, if you go back to the early 2000s when they began to really have great influence, especially in the wake of 9/11, and you look at how their enterprise has played itself out, not just in Iran, but in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and so forth and so on, it's been failure at almost every point. And very importantly, all of these neoconservatives, and especially someone like Kagan, is deeply committed to Israel and cares greatly about the welfare of Israel. And I don't see how anybody who is as smart as Kagan, looking at Israel today, doesn't understand that this is a country that is in real trouble and its trajectory is downhill over time. So for all those reasons, I'm not surprised. But again, to see him say this in the pages of the Atlantic Monthly is really quite stunning.
The conversation turns to a prominent neoconservative voice acknowledging major strategic setbacks involving the U.S. and a key ally against a Middle Eastern power. Surprising given the author's ideological background. Takeaway: even staunch advocates of assertive foreign policies are confronting the limits of prolonged engagements. This admission reveals how repeated interventions across multiple theaters have yielded diminishing returns, straining alliances and resources. It highlights the importance of realistic assessments over ideological commitments, as persistent failures can force reevaluations even among hawks. Broader lessons include the high costs of overextension, financial, military, and reputational, and the need for strategies grounded in achievable outcomes rather than transformative ambitions. Such shifts in elite opinion can signal deeper systemic challenges in maintaining global influence when confronted with resilient adversaries. Can insiders change course before it's too late?
Oh, they thought that we could use air power alone to topple the regime in Tehran and put in place a regime that would dance to our tune. In other words, we, the Israelis and the Americans, had four basic goals here. One was regime change. Two was to put an end to the nuclear enrichment program. Three was to get Iran to stop supporting Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Hamas. And then finally, to put an end to their long-range missile program. Those were the four goals. And the key goal, as I've emphasized before, was regime change. Because once you get regime change, you can take care of the other three goals. And the administration, pushed by the Israelis, believed that we could knock off the regime and we could satisfy all of those goals very quickly. And the problem here is that the historical record is perfectly clear that there is no case of using air power alone to topple a regime. And furthermore, even if we had toppled the regime, there was no guarantee whatsoever that we'd get a new regime that would dance to our tune. So this was really a cockamamie strategy to begin with. And as the New York Times reported in that famous article they wrote describing the decision-making process, virtually all of President Trump's advisors told him that this was a cockamamie idea. And it was the Israelis, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the head of Mossad, David Barnea, who convinced the president that we had a theory of victory that was going to pan out. And that, of course, proved not to be the case. And then once it didn't work, we were in the soup, the deep soup, right? Which is where we are now.
Analysis covers over-reliance on aerial operations to achieve regime alteration and containment of regional proxies, ignoring historical precedents and internal warnings. Key objectives like dismantling nuclear efforts and proxy networks proved elusive. Takeaway: military history repeatedly shows air campaigns alone rarely topple entrenched governments or install compliant successors, often leading to prolonged quagmires. Decision-making influenced heavily by external partners overlooked expert cautions, illustrating risks of groupthink and external lobbying in high-stakes policy. The result is strategic entrapment, where initial optimism collides with ground realities, depleting assets without resolution. This case study warns against quick victory theories that underestimate adversary resilience and overstate technological superiority. Effective policy requires humility, diverse input, and contingency planning to avoid being drawn into conflicts with no clear exit. Why do powerful nations repeat the same strategic errors? Subscribe to World Talk Recap and join our community for deeper dives into global affairs.
I think Chaz is right. It is an entente, and the war did have that effect. I mean, both the Russians and the Chinese have a deep-seated interest in making sure that Iran does not lose. And by the way, I would add the Turks to that list as well. The Turks, the Russians, and the Chinese all have a vested interest in making sure that Iran hangs on. And I think from Russia's point of view, and even China's point of view, it's not such a bad thing if the United States remains bogged down in the war against Iran, because if we do, then it makes it very difficult for us to think about containing China in East Asia. In fact, it weakens our position in East Asia. And furthermore, it weakens our position in the Ukraine war. It makes it more difficult for us to support the Ukrainians. And furthermore, we're actually helping the Russians by taking sanctions off some of their oil that they sell in global markets. So I think the Russians and the Chinese have a vested interest in doing what they can to help Iran win this war.
The conflict accelerates cooperation among non-Western powers, creating informal alignments that counterbalance U.S. efforts while diverting attention from other regions like East Asia. Takeaway: geopolitical pressures often forge unexpected partnerships based on shared survival interests, even without formal treaties. Here, mutual concerns over regional stability draw major players closer, complicating unilateral actions and extending conflicts indirectly. This dynamic weakens the initiator's leverage elsewhere, demonstrating how one theater can cascade effects globally. It emphasizes multipolarity's rise, where no single actor dominates unchallenged. Policymakers must anticipate these ripple effects, prioritizing diplomacy to manage rivalries rather than fueling coalitions through overreach. Long-term, such shifts challenge established dominance and demand adaptive, less confrontational approaches. Are we witnessing the birth of a new global order?
I don't think he has many cards to play. I've not read anything where anybody can tell a story that he has cards to play. It seems to me that what he's going to want from China is some help in pressuring Iran to come to an agreement that ends the war on terms that are relatively favorable to the United States. That's simply not going to happen. And I think what Xi is going to want is that Xi is going to want President Trump to say that he's going to slow down or cut back or not continue to fund Taiwan and do everything possible to separate the link between the United States and Taiwan. But I don't think that Xi will be successful there either, as desperate as President Trump will be. So I don't think that much will come out of this meeting. Of course, that's traditionally how it works, and it's certainly the way it works when you're dealing with complicated issues. I remember during the Cold War when we would negotiate arms control treaties with the Soviet Union, the people who negotiated those treaties before they were signed by the respective presidents went to enormous lengths to dot every I and cross every T. And the way it worked back then was the way you described it. But that's not the way President Trump operates. He's a fly by the seat of your pants operator. He doesn't believe that experts matter. He's not interested in preparing for serious negotiations. And the end result is quite clear. You know how well the Ukrainian The negotiations to end the Ukraine war have worked out, right?
Right.
Complete
Right.
failure. How about the negotiations to end the genocide in Palestine? That's failed. We could go on and on. And if you sort of look at how he conducts business vis-a-vis the Iranians, this is not a serious negotiating strategy. And finally, I would point out that the people that he employs to do his negotiating, the people who should be dotting the I's and crossing the T's, are total amateurs, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. We just don't have the A team in there. And as a result, we get no agreements.
Wow.
Focus shifts to upcoming leader meetings, limited leverage, and contrasts in preparation styles between impulsive approaches and traditional meticulous groundwork. Takeaway: summits between major powers rarely produce breakthroughs without prior detailed groundwork by specialists. A preference for personal instincts over expert processes often yields suboptimal or failed outcomes, as seen in multiple ongoing crises. Amateur involvement in complex talks further erodes effectiveness. This reveals structural challenges in achieving deals amid domestic pressures and mismatched priorities. Successful statecraft values institutional knowledge and patience, highlighting how leadership style influences results. In tense environments, clear communication and realistic expectations matter more than dramatic gestures, underscoring preparation's role in preserving options. What really happens behind closed doors in superpower talks? Subscribe to World Talk Recap for more recaps that break down the headlines.
Well, we have a deep-seated interest, we meaning the United States, in staying out of China's way as much as possible. The United States is bogged down in this terrible war in Iran, and it can't get itself out. And the last thing we need is a crisis in East Asia. So you can rest assured that when President Trump arrives in China, that he's going to go to great lengths to smooth any ruffled feathers that he finds in China, because he does not want a crisis in China. And of course, the Chinese have a series of problems of their own, especially in terms of their domestic economy. And furthermore, their military is not in a position where it can take advantage of America's weakness in East Asia these days. There's no question that he has taken major steps to upgrade the Chinese military, and its capability vis-a-vis the United States has improved significantly over the past few years. And we, for a while, were interested in matching the Chinese and pursuing a containment policy in East Asia. This is what the pivot to Asia was all about. But what's happened now is that we're pivoting away from Asia. What's happening is that we're pulling, Patriots and other systems out of East Asia, and we're also moving ground forces. We're moving that we moved that Marine Expeditionary Unit, the 31st MEU, out of Japan. It's now in the Middle East. So if anything, we've been pivoting away from Asia. And again, this is why the United States does not want the security. We're not down to zero. I think we have badly damaged our stock of boutique weapons that we would need if we were in a conflict with China or any other country around the world. And I think one of the reasons that we stopped the fighting, we stopped the bombing against Iran, and one of the reasons that President Trump is not interested in starting it up again is because we run the great danger of actually going to a point where we have hardly anything left. Our inventories are depleted. That would be the word I would use. They're badly depleted. There's no question about that. And by the way, you want to remember that General Kane told President Trump before the war started against Iran that this was one of the great dangers that we faced, that we did not have a large stock of weaponry that we could draw on to fight the war against Iran without endangering our situation in East Asia. Because Kane surely understood that before the war started on February 28th, we had already at that point given large numbers of weapons to the Israelis and to the Ukrainians. And we were in trouble before February 28th. And since February 28th, we've got ourselves even into deeper trouble. And then again, if you hypothesize a situation where we foolishly start this war up again, I'm talking here about the bombing campaign against Iran, we will probably have hardly anything left at the end of it. And we won't win in the process.
Wow.
Discussions address resource depletion from multiple commitments, reduced focus on Asia, and the eastward movement of economic and technological influence. Takeaway: sustained engagements across distant regions erode readiness for peer-level challenges, particularly as demographic and economic trends favor rising powers. Wealth and population advantages, combined with technological progress, enable competitors to close gaps rapidly. Past policies unintentionally accelerated this shift through engagement that boosted rivals. The result is a narrower margin for error, where distractions in secondary areas amplify vulnerabilities. This transition period calls for strategic prioritization, domestic revitalization, and avoidance of unnecessary drains. Recognizing relative decline early allows for wiser resource allocation and competitive innovation rather than denial. Is the era of unchallenged dominance ending?
Oh, I think Israel is in deep trouble. First of all, it's very hard to tell what effect this war has had on Israel because the Israelis have done a brilliant job of not letting any information get out about the damage that's been done to the country. Now, we know from various reports in places like the New York Times and the Washington Post that the amount of damage the Iranians have done to American military bases in the region is much greater than we thought at first. It's quite clear that those Iranian missiles are very powerful and very accurate, and they have done an enormous amount of damage to the American basing structure. Well, if that's true, shouldn't it be the case that those same missiles and those drones that have been used against our bases are doing similar damage in Israel? You certainly would think so. You would certainly think that a lot of damage has been done inside of Israel. That's point number one. Point number two is there have to be huge economic consequences associated with fighting a war like this. Huge numbers of reservists have been called up and have served multiple tours. And there are all sorts of articles that point out that this has a damaging effect on the economy. Furthermore, if you look at Israel's performance, they have not defeated Hezbollah. Hezbollah is alive and well and firing missiles into northern Israel and actually clobbering the IDF on the battlefields of southern Lebanon. Hamas has not been defeated. The Israelis are also, deeply engaged in military operations in southern Syria, and they're launching pogroms on the West Bank. This is a state that does nothing but fight wars year after year. And one would think that this is going to have a significant effect not only on the economy, but also just on the basic Weltanschauung of the country, just the way they think about life. And I see all sorts of evidence that lots of Israelis are leaving the country, that they're dissatisfied with life in Israel because Israel lives in a constant state of war. And this situation shows no signs of changing. And I think it does not bode well for Israel's future.
Examination of one ally's mounting difficulties, information control, economic tolls, and parallels to past leaders burdened by intractable conflicts. Takeaway: prolonged warfare imposes hidden cumulative costs, human, financial, and psychological, that can destabilize even advanced societies. Demographic outflows and persistent threats signal deeper societal fatigue. Leadership facing quagmires often exhibits personal tolls reminiscent of historical precedents, where wars consume political capital and well-being. This illustrates intervention risks. Short-term assertions yield long-term erosion. Sustainable security requires balancing defense with internal cohesion. Observers should watch for signs of overcommitment that undermine long-term viability, favoring de-escalation where possible to preserve strength. How much can constant conflict reshape a nation? Subscribe to World Talk Recap to stay informed on these critical global conversations.